much. I'm honored to be here, and I've been working on this graphic novel for probably the last over 10 years now, and it's finally completed, and I have a Kickstarter campaign going on right now to get the books printed, and we've already reached that threshold. So if anyone's interested in getting a book, they are available on Kickstarter. But let me just show everybody really quick a little video that I have that's on my Kickstarter, and that'd be kind of a nice little introduction to this to the graphic novel. Graphic nonfiction, I guess, is the correct term, the correct way to say it, or nonfiction graphic novel, I guess. Anyway, and then we can jump into the talk. So let me share my screen really quick here. And okay, so here's okay, there we go. Now let me here, I'll do this really quick. And okay, so that's that's my little video on my Kickstarter page there. And so yeah, people often ask me, they're like, so why the Crescent Hotel? What so I'm going to kind of go into that, but first before I do that, let me share my presentation here. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so I don't know if everyone's aware, but just a couple of years ago in 2019, a grim discovery was made was on the grounds of the Crescent Hotel there in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And that discovery garnished national attention. So a landscaper was digging and came across hundreds of jars containing what appeared to be human tissue preserved in alcohol, along with Norman Baker's cancer cure and reels of 16 millimeter film advertisements for his cancer elixir. So anyway, now we're going to back up a little bit, quite a ways back to whenever I was a kid, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why Eureka Springs, why my interest in the Crescent Hotel. So when I was a kid, my family would visit the town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And if you haven't been to Eureka Springs, I highly recommend it. It's absolutely beautiful and extremely unique. So this picturesque Victorian hamlet lies between the Arkansas, Boston, and Ozark mountain ranges, with its charming yet odd and elaborate Queen Anne dwellings perched on limestone bluffs, steep jagged elevations, serpentine roads that don't intersect, and a subterranean village buried beneath. Eureka Springs is deemed one of the 9 most unusual towns in the U.S. by Ripley's Believe It or Not. And it earns its reputation, believe me. Till this day, I'm still intrigued by the aberrant kind of maze-like geometry and geology that's found in this stair-step town. Along with right here, we have the Basin Park Hotel, and it's 7 street-level entrances on each floor. That was one of the things that Robert Ripley deemed, as one of the strange, unique features of the town, because on every single floor you're at ground level. It's because it's up against a mountain there. So Eureka Springs is the only city in America, the only city in the entire U.S. whose historic downtown is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's another very interesting and unique aspect to the town. None of the streets cross at right angles, and there's no stoplights. The layout is irregular. So these are all images from my book. So these images that I'm showing go along with, I've painted all these, I've drawn all these, and anyway, it's like my book. It's a very visual experience. So in Eureka, the natural elements in the Victorian architecture, they just sort of coalesce, where houses and buildings, they seem to cling together, steep mountainsides and nestle in deep gorges along widening streets, and each kind of adapting to their own unique terrain, right? So, however, the most unique and compelling and mysterious feature to me as a child, and always has been, is the Crescent Hotel that sits at the highest point of town on Crescent Drive, with its very dark and bizarre and varied history. So what about the Crescent? Let's discuss the actual hotel for just a bit. So the hotel was built in 1886. Eureka Springs was rapidly becoming a well-known health resort. Arkansas Governor Powell Clayton developed a railroad system that made Eureka Springs accessible to tourists, and he was credited with getting the hotel built. The hotel was designed in an American Gothic style by St. Louis architect Isaac Stockton Taylor, using limestone from the nearby White River. Now, despite all its splendor, the hotel was not lucrative. And in 1908, the Crescent College and Conservatory for Young Women was founded to supplement lagging winter hotel business. And then sadly, in 1934, the Great Depression ended both the school and the hotel. And these were pretty much our residents throughout the mid 1930s, was the rodents, maybe a few ghosts here and there. Anyway, it sat empty for a few years until it underwent a total transformation. And then in 1937, it reopened as a cancer hospital, and thus beginning the most bizarre chapter in the curious history of this very unique piece of real estate. So back to whenever I was a kid, my family and we would go on the Crescent Hotel ghost tours, and I learned of its very, assorted history and the ghosts that were said to haunt the premises. But what lingered with me over the years was the story of this fraudulent medical practitioner who in the late 1930s transformed the hotel into an abnormal hospital. It just kind of baffled me, and it just kind of haunted me over the years, because these kind of elements of like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Stephen King's The Shining left me morbidly intrigued. And so in 2003, I moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas from Missouri, where I grew up, for graduate school to pursue my master's in fine art. While in school, I visited Eureka Springs with my fiance, now my wife, and we went on the ghost tour. So once again, hearing these very horrific stories of a flamboyant charlatan dressed in white and purple coming into town in his purple car with the supposed cancer cure and preying on patients afflicted with this disease. So now many of these stories involved liquid cancer cures being poured directly into patients' skulls, and hundreds of patients unaccounted for, and exorbitant amounts of calcium found in the basements and the walls and the floor. And so obviously these stories were growing over the years and morphing and distorting into these kind of sensational stories. And so I was like, I had to understand like what really happened, what was the real story about Norman Baker and his time at who was he and what actually happened at the Crescent Hotel in the late 1930s. So let's see here. So a little skeptical, the next day, my wife and I visited the local library and was surprised to find that there was not much information on the enigmatic Baker and his time at the Crescent Hotel. So I later conducted extensive research that led me to Baker's very assorted and complicated past, and what was even more bizarre than the stories I'd been told. But who was Norman Baker? So who was this guy? Okay, so Norman Baker was born in 1889 in Muscatine, Iowa. He was a machinist turned vaudeville magician. As a means to publicize his stage performance, he develops the first calliope he calls the calliophone, and it runs on air instead of steam. So, I mean, the guy was brilliant. Like, he actually developed the air calliope. He called the calliophone. And there's people today that just know Norman Baker for this invention. Like, it's a collector's item. Some people still collect these rare calliophons from this period. Anyway, so during this time, cancer was becoming a leading cause of death in the U.S., and his mother died of cancer. Her untimely death created an interest in life extension. So Baker then starts his own radio station, and in 1925 begins publicizing his cancer cures. And he's also lashing out against his enemies, including the American Medical Association. He opens the Baker Hospital in a former skating rink in Muscatine, Iowa. He publishes TNT magazine. TNT is an acronym for The Naked Truth. He publishes this in 1929, where along with his medical exposés, it serves as Baker's general merchandising publication. So you could sort of think of that as like a Sears and Roebuck catalog. So he claims to have the cure for cancer in this magazine. And so what Baker does is he offers to treat 5 patients with his miraculous cure free of charge. He then prints his December 1929 issue of TNT magazine about the patients and his miraculous cure. By May of 1930, just in a few months, all the patients are dead. And then he reprints the very same story, proclaiming his cure through his magazine and on his radio station again and again without changing a word. So anyway, if that doesn't kind of raise some red flags there. So anyway, the AMA pressures the Federal Radio Commission to start cracking down on Norman Baker, and he loses his license, his radio license, in 1931, as well as, and he, after an unsuccessful attempt to sue the AMA, he takes off and starts a radio station on the Mexican border. And by 1934, he's amassed a fortune. And of course, he considers himself something of a medical expert, although, of course, he hasn't had a single day of medical training. Baker then, he eventually makes his way to Arkansas, and in 1937, he purchases the downtrodden Crescent Hotel. Now that kind of brings us back to where we were earlier with the abandoned Crescent Hotel. So the town of Eureka Springs developed around these healing springs, and Norman Baker said in an interview that it was an influencing factor towards his move to this Ozark town, and the pure mountain air and the healthy spring waters. So Baker remodels the hotel to look more like a circus than a hotel. So this is pretty much what it looked like before. And then after Baker remodels it, he completely transforms it into this very bizarre circus-like motif with Art Deco triangular patterns throughout, and golds and purples and reds and orange and yellow. The beams and columns were painted this sort of hodgepodge of red, black, yellow, and he put propaganda posters all over the hallways. He had many of the interior doors removed and wrote populist propaganda across many of the interior walls. You can see right here where it's like, quacks are those who do things enemies can't do. So he's sort of, he was obviously a cancer quack, and that's what he was called by, members of like the American Medical Association. So he's sort of owning that and using that in his propaganda. So one of the worst things as far as the damage done to the actual hotel itself was on the exterior. The original wooden porches and their wood turned balustrades were ripped out. He had those removed. And so 4 floors of concrete were poured in their place to make sun porches that would support the weight of patient beds that were rolled out. Now, this changed the building so dramatically that it permanently damaged the Victorian appearance of the hotel. So I think that was one of the worst, architecturally, one of the worst disasters as far as the actual hotel itself. In Baker's purple walled office was his hexagonal desk with bulletproof glass separating it from the lobby. So he was a very, very cautious individual. And a machine gun nearby. If you notice, just right behind him. Interesting little element is that you can actually see his desk still there at the Crescent Hotel in the lobby. So that very hotel is still there to this day. So anyway, the hotel was advertised widely in his brochure, advertising where sick folks get well, and we cure cancer tumor without operation, radium, or X-ray. Now, so during this time, the money was rolling in despite the Great Depression. So Eureka Springs never really was affected by the Great Depression. Like it was actually doing well, because of this so-called cancer hospital, but sadly, as the patient death toll was rising, it was rising. Thankfully, so were law enforcement investigations. So anyway, in 1939, Baker was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 4 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary. So after being released from prison, he tries unsuccessfully to start back up his cancer hospital. He eventually retires in Miami, Florida, living out his remaining years on a 3-story yacht, and he dies of cancer. So very, very ironic, very somewhat appropriate, I suppose. So in 2008, I interviewed a man who, as a child, ventured into the abandoned Crescent Hotel in the early 1940s with a friend after Baker's arrest. So throughout the World War II, the Crescent Hotel sat empty. Well, empty save for the faint scampering of rodents and the footsteps of the night watchman. So as the boys worked their way through the abandoned Baker Hospital, they made many strange discoveries that told an even stranger story. Instead of sterile white walls within the building, they found circus-colored interiors and Art Deco decor among forgotten wheelchairs and cancer is curable posters. So they moved deeper into the basement that served as the hospital morgue, and they made a very grim discovery. What they found, in fact, was the very same macabre set of jars containing human tissue and the so-called cancer cure elixirs that would be buried and later unearthed on the hotel grounds 80 years later. So the boys were fascinated and horrified by their discovery. But what these boys failed to realize was that this abandoned building they entered wasn't really a hospital, nor was it a hotel. It was the remnants of an abandoned theater by a sideshow magician whose performance had ended. His cancer healing elixir was made up of carbolic acid, alcohol, glycerin, and spring water, but his formula's true ingredient was demagoguery and populist rhetoric. The relics discovered by the boys together told a story of the past and predictions of the future, of a charlatan's performance that had been repeated throughout the ages and continues to this day. One that, rather than garnish applause as the curtain falls, ends with an empty silence, an empty promise, an empty cure, an empty structure. Now, Norman Baker died lonely, but throughout his life, those he met either became his devoted followers or his mortal enemies. Even 60 years after his death, he still divides people. Just after his funeral, his grave was destroyed and later replaced. The gravesite to this day is mysteriously decorated with purple flowers on the anniversary of his death. So love him or hate him, at the core, this book is about perception. We see history the way we want to see it. This very unique nonfiction graphic novel is my best interpretation of this peculiar person, place, and time. And although Norman Baker has been gone for many years now, echoes of his time in Eureka Springs still reverberate throughout the Crescent Hotel. So before I jump off, I just want to and answer some questions. I just want to briefly just kind of talk about the process. So my book blends oral histories, newspaper articles, and Baker's own vanity biography that coalesced into a visually stunning narrative. I began working on this project way back in 2008. Since then, I've interviewed scores of people in both Muscatine, Iowa, and Eureka Springs. I've scoured library archives and databases. I've dug through old newspapers, letters, old photos, court documents, books, criminal records, and microfiche. I even spent time exploring cemeteries and locating graves of people that are found in this particular book. Then came the very difficult portion of the process, organizing all the materials into one cohesive narrative. So that was very difficult. I would file the information in terms of subject matter and period, and then put together a timeline of events, both Norman Baker and of the Crescent Hotel. So it's moments like that really helps to have a wife that's a librarian. So that's my wife's librarian. So that was a plus, let me tell you. So now is my favorite part. I sharpen my pencils and I get to drawing. And so here you can see my cat Buzz, which I'm surprised we haven't heard him yet. He's right around here. He basically serves as my art director. You can see Buzz there on my drawing table. So I began putting a script together using all the collected interviews, photos, and other research. Originally, the story was written in paragraph form and then reworked into a script. I draw very rough storyboards while scripting the book. After turning my roughs into tight pencils, I then begin spotting the dark areas using watercolor and building up value for dramatic light and shadow. This is very important for strong contrast to help ensure a good printing quality. I then introduce color. Much of the book is color coded, so different periods are represented by an overall color tone. So here's an example of a pencil panel next to a final version in full value and color. I often write notes to myself when roughing out pages for this book. So here are my roughs next to my pencils. And then you can kind of see my pencils next to the value color and value in watercolor, and then digitally adding word balloons, dialogue boxes, and lettering. So anyway, here's another example of pencils to final color without lettering. And one more example of the process. So it's a very involved process, but it's an effective one. I really try to push the dramatic effect, and I think by building up value and strong lights and darks, it really helps. It helps develop this sense of mystery and drama. So I had very many props that I used for reference, and that I went out and I bought a 1930s period model car. That's actually like what Baker owned right there, and so I would use that as reference. Old car radios, I found old medical equipment, and so on. Part of the challenge for 1930s attire is finding period clothing reference that was not only of the era, but also appropriate for the region, because we're not talking, Park Avenue, New York City, 1930s. We're talking the Ozarks. So I had to be appropriate to the Ozarks region. And I thoroughly researched not only the history, but also the geography of the Crescent Hotel and its various periods of history. The hotel became more of a character in this book, and the reader will traverse the historic building throughout the various ages of its assorted past. As I mentioned before, at its core, the book is about perception. We all perceive our reality and history different. We draw on our own interpretations based on a myriad of factors that influence our understanding of places and events. I look forward to taking you all on this journey, and hopefully this book will inspire you to continue the story and draw your own conclusions by exploring this most unusual hotel and traversing the same halls the patients and the staff of the Baker Hospital did so many years ago. So thank you so much. This is what the book will look like. And yeah, please jump on the Kickstarter, and there's my website. You can find Kickstarter link there, and also hop on the newsletter while you're at it if you'd like more information and upcoming events. So anyway, thank you very much. And does anyone have any questions at all?
Thank you so much, Sean. That was fascinating.
Yeah, would you like me to?
You can leave that up if you want.
Sure.
Take it down either way.
That's fine.
We can do it either way. Yeah. So I've been to Eureka Springs. I mean, I don't know many Arkansans who haven't been to Eureka Springs.
Right.
We used to go there a lot, growing up. And but I don't know that I've ever stayed. I was thinking about this as you were talking. I don't know that I've ever stayed at the Crescent. I've been to the Crescent. I've been to a wedding at the Crescent.
Yeah.
They had some condos that they had built in the Faye Jones style kind of on the side. I've stayed in those, and we've stayed at the Basin, but I don't know that I've ever stayed at the Crescent. So I sort of want to want to go and stay there. Maybe my husband's watching.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
So we have lots of questions. The questions just started rolling in. So
wow.
that's
Okay.
great. But
okay.
I really appreciate you talking about your process, because I think that's you know, I obviously enjoy the history, but the process is so fascinating to me. And so I jotted down a couple of questions. So, you know, you do your art, you do your pencil, you do your watercolors, and then I'm guessing you scan them to add the word bubbles as part of the printing process.
Correct. Yeah. Then I after they're scanned, I then digitally add the word balloons and the word dialogue boxes, those little squares. And I do that digitally in Adobe Illustrator, and then I move them all into Photoshop because they're high res scans. So the actual images are in Photoshop, and then I'll create those word balloons in Illustrator, and then I move them over into the files in Photoshop, and then I can also make any little tweaks and adjustments and color corrections and special effects like lighting effects and stuff like that. I kind of look at, since I do the majority of my work by hand, I like using, I love digital applications, and I use those as more almost like a special effects tool, you know? So yeah, and then just getting them all ready for the printer. So
no, that's right. And I love that you used kind of color, the tone of the color as it moved through different time periods. I had noticed that in the pictures. I mean, I just thought that was a nice, that's a nice little touch.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to be sure and keep people on track. So when they're reading the story, they would know it's like, okay, well, I'm at the Crescent Hotel in the present, you know, era, or I'm at the Crescent Hotel during the time of the Baker Hospital. See, Baker was obsessed with the color purple, and so there's a overall sort of purple toned out color throughout, and then during his time. And then when I moved back to the early 20th century, late 19th century, it has more of a sepia tones. And then in the present, I use more greens. And so that way it kind of, it just keeps you on track, you know? Yeah. So great.
So we'll go to questions in the chat now. One question is, has current owner Elise Ronick, maybe, I hope I pronounced that right.
Elise Ronick,
Ronick had input into your story or on your story?
No, I actually, you know, it's funny. I actually just met Elise recently, within the last month or so. And so, yeah, she was very, very excited and happy about that the book is coming out. And no, it's funny. I've actually, over the years, I've talked with a lot of people at the Crescent Hotel, including the former ghost tour guide. He was the head of tours at both the Crescent and the Basin Park Hotel, and he's been a wonderful. It's Keith Scales, and he's been a wonderful resource throughout, you know, the creation of this book. And I've actually stayed at the Writers Colony at Derry Hollow. I did a week-long residency there back in, when was that? 2011. So I've been working on this for a long time. And I went and interviewed people all over Eureka Springs during that time. In fact, I gave a talk at the Crescent Hotel right around that time as well. 2010, 2011, somewhere around there. So yeah, everybody's, and they've all known about it, and a lot of people, you know, that work there and that have stayed there have been, it's kind of been on their radar over the years, you know. So.
I think that's one of the, I mean, you kind of mentioned it in the beginning, but I think that's one of the really cool things about Eureka Springs is that they really embrace all of the weirdness, and I love that. That's what makes it such a cool place.
Absolutely.
So, another question we have, did Baker employ nurses, and did they know he was a fake?
That's a good question. He did employ nurses. He had license. He had doctors, actual doctors working there. And so, the thing is with Baker is that he claimed to be, you would say, more of a holistic type doctor. You know what I mean? And so there are actually aspects to what he was doing that I look at and I'm like, hey, that actually is pretty good, because he's talking about clean, the mountain air and whole well, what we call whole food, holistic type foods and organic foods, I guess you could say. He was against the aluminum trust because he was actually looking at that as a carcinogen. And this is like in the 1920s and 30s, before people realized that. And he was like, so he said that was bad and that could cause cancer. And also just the very fact that he embraced the color purple, which the color purple is a very soothing sort of color. And Baker knew that. He was very smart. However, his cancer cure, it was, as I said, it was a mixture of alcohol, glycerin, carbolic acid, brewed in like a tea with watermelon seeds. And guess what? It doesn't cure cancer. And so, I can almost see, like, if you're, if you're going there and that's your last hope, and it's like, like as a, I know there's some people went to the Baker Hospital that actually survived. Well, once again, they were the ones that didn't have cancer. Like, they were misdiagnosed. And also, you could see that maybe like there's sort of a placebo effect going with, some people that were maybe had some sort of ailment, that just the power of positive thinking might have helped them out a little bit. But, like I said, he wasn't curing cancer. And I think some people just jumped on board with that idea that it's more just like sort of a place to go, like a resort to just kind of go and try to, get better. Mm-hmm. But like I said, his cancer cure, unfortunately was not, it wasn't a cure. And so that's the question that still people today ask, like, well, did these people believe it? Like, there's actually people today that think, yeah, Baker did good and he was actually there to help people. And then of course there's so many people that, look at him as a shyster, and then he was preying on people's last hopes and profiting off dying patients, and so it's one of those things. Yeah.
That leads right into our next question. Someone says, did Norman Baker actually believe that he had the cure for cancer?
Well, Norman Baker was such a conundrum. Honestly, he, like I said, he was into the power of positive thought, which that's a great thing. I think it's good to be positive, but let me tell you, like, one of the things that was so bizarre about Norman Baker, there were many things, but one of the things was that his cancer brochures claimed that they did, like, we performed no x-rays, no radium, no surgery. Yet, why did he also, in his magazine, he had ads with jars proclaiming, it was those jars that were uncovered at the Crescent with human tissue, like with malignant tumors in these jars. And it's like, well, why were these extracted if you don't do any sort of operation? Then, and so that is so bizarre to me. That's one of the things I never was able to understand. And one of the things, like, as when Baker actually did die, I don't think he never did really, he turned actual, medical, like hospitals down. So he didn't, he was so adamant against, he was so against the American Medical Association and just medicine in general, that, as when he became sick and eventually died in the late 1950s, he died on his yacht, like he just died, and so, I do think that Baker did believe that in a way, like you could just take his cure and it's almost this placebo that makes you, like you can will yourself to health,
Right.
even if you have cancer. I think part of him did think that, but a lot of people died, and I don't think and like I said, I mean, when he, early on when he had his test patients, and then all 5 of them died, and then he reprinted it without changing a single word. He reprinted it like 3 different times. So I don't know about that. That's a little
Yeah, that's a little iffy.
Iffy there.
Yeah. So in the book, do you get into the alleged hauntings of the Crescent Hotel?
I actually do. So I look at the Crescent Hotel as a character, much like Baker, as I was saying kind of on my slideshow. And I mean, you can't go to the Crescent without feeling this, like there's so much history there. And it is very, this old, this very old, American Gothic structure that you just can't help but have this sort of eerie, sort of haunting feeling of just the weight of all the past as you walk those halls. And so I actually did. So let me tell you, like a good ghost story or a good ghost tour is actually a good history tour. And when I was a kid, the tours were very sensational and they weren't very historic. But then, like I mentioned, when Keith Scales got there, he's an historian. I mean, he really knows his stuff, and he really made it a great ghost tour because he went into all the history, and they were great. And so I included like kind of an abbreviated version of his ghost tour. So like it's at the early on in the book, it's like you're actually, like I said, there's different periods throughout the story. And so at one period you're in the present, or at one point you're in the present, and then you're at the Baker, during the late 1930s, and then early on in the late 19th century. But when you're in the present, I sort of, I have myself in the book as somebody, interviewing people and sketching and talking to people. And so I'm actually on the ghost tour in the book, and I'm just, writing stuff down. But I look at that as a great way to sort of, you can almost think of the Baker Hospital, like that era, as being sort of the origin story for a lot of the ghosts, in a way. For a lot of those ghost stories, because a lot of them obviously were born from that period. So it was almost impossible for me not to mention that aspect, because it is today the Crescent Hotel is known as one of the the most haunted hotels in the U.S. And that a lot of that comes from back in around early 2000s. I want to say like around 2005 or so. The TAPS guys, what's it called, Ghost Hunters, those guys.
Yes. One of those Discovery Channel shows, I think.
Right, one of those. They went there and they had sort of a like a reflection down in the morgue of a full on sort of apparition. And so I don't know if that was, it could have been a reflection off something. It could have been an actual, something. Maybe they had some event and that, but regardless of what it was that moment that happened. Like they got that on film. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of their most widely, publicized and watched episodes of Ghost Hunters, was at the Crescent Hotel. So since then, it's just exploded as far as being this, very haunted place to go and visit. And the ghost tours have really, really kind of taken off. So yeah, I definitely had to include that in the book because it's almost synonymous now with the hotel as, the ghost tours. So
someone asks, is the original hospital, still in Iowa?
No, it's not. That actually is. It was an old roller skating rink originally, and then Baker turned it into the Baker Hospital, and it was up for quite a while. Up until I think it was eventually torn down like in the 80s or something like that, because I've gone there and it's actually the Han part. It's the Han office chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually their parking lot, because there's a huge Han. I can't remember if it's like a factory or distribution center or what, but it's the Han parking lot right now is where the Baker Hospital once stood. So yeah, no, but so that's not there, and neither is where his radio station once stood, which is interesting because that both his radio station in Muscatine and the Crescent Hotel in Eureka are at the highest points of the town, and in both towns. So Baker had this thing about being, obviously he had this huge ego, and so he had to physically be above everyone as well as mentally. But I love that you asked that, because that was one of the other reasons that I was so drawn to the story of the Crescent Hotel and its time as the Baker Hospital, because I was actually able to go there, and I could it's so well, much of the hotel is so well preserved that you can really get a good sense, and there's enough photographs that I could reconstruct it visually as the way it was. And so that was great, because gosh, I don't know if y'all knew this, but in the like early 1990s, before Elise and Marty Rennick moved to Eureka Springs and saved the Crescent Hotel, it was actually going to be torn down and turned into a chicken farm. So thankfully, yeah, Elise Rennick and her husband Marty, they saved it and restored the hotel to pretty much to its former glory. Of course they weren't able to do like the Victorian porch that we talked about, that was that Baker had destroyed, but it's been pretty much restored. And yeah, you can, and
That's
so
great.
that's, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a fantastic, I just can't imagine Eureka Springs without
the Crescent Hotel.
No,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense. It's so
Yeah.
bizarre but it worked out. So thankfully, yeah.
So another question is, how many of the patients treated at Baker's Hospital are buried in nearby cemeteries? And were you able to find much documentation of names of patients treated there?
Yeah, I actually did. I found right at the moment, I cannot tell you how many, but I did find quite a few, a list of the deaths, the people that died at the Baker Hospital in Eureka Springs, and it was a few pages of people, like names going down. I can't honestly tell you how many, but it was like a list, good sized list in a few pages, and it said kind of where they were from around the U.S., because they came from all over. It'd
be interesting to look in the census, in one of the censuses, to see if if they recorded, because they did a lot of times, inmates and hospitals and things like that were listed on separate schedules. So that might be interesting to take a look.
Yeah, some of those patients were, like Baker was, he did, that's bad for business to have people dying. So some of them, he would have them, have them take, it's like, okay, well, you got to leave as they're dying. And then, but yeah, there were quite a few people that did die there at the Crescent Hotel. And there are a few people buried in the cemetery there, but not many.
So another question, did you know from the outset that this would take shape as a graphic novel? And if so, were there moments in your research and discovery of this sordid history that you thought, how could I make this work visually?
Yes. I did. Well, okay. So when I was a kid, I didn't know that would, because I've been so kind of fascinated by that area and that hotel since I was a kid. But yeah, once I moved to Eureka in the late, or in 2003, and I my wife and I went down there and we visit, and I, like I said, I just was so fascinated by that. I thought, and at that time I had done a graphic novel. In fact, it's a graphic, it's a work of fiction that I'm actually going to be printing. I've had a low print run of it, but I'm actually going to be reprinting it again here before long. And so I had done some graphic novels in the past. And so that's a medium that I've just always been fascinated by. I'm very visual, and I also love like cinema, early cinema. I'm a huge like Hitchcock fan, and a lot of old like film noir and all that kind of stuff, Gothic films and books and all that. Yeah, I love Gothic stories. That's another thing. Like I love like Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca and Shirley Jackson's The Haunting at Hill House. That stuff kind of reminds me because his Eureka chapter is very much like a Gothic chapter of the book, But anyway, yeah. So what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry, that was a two-part question.
I'd scrolled up. Okay, let me find it. Were there moments in your research and discovery of this sordid history that you thought, how do I make this work visually?
Oh yeah. I honestly, I always knew how I would do that because like, I love working with light and shadow and there's just so many, it's such an unusual place. The town itself is so unusual. And yeah, I never really, it never really was a problem for me to turn that into a visual. Like I looked at it as a visual, medium. Like the whole time, I always felt like that's the way it has to be because, yeah, because like I said, the hotel is such a character. The city itself is a character, and Baker is such a character. Like he drove a purple Cord Roadster was the car and obviously he had that custom job, and he wore these white suits with purple shirts and purple ties. It was such a character, that it's like it lends itself, it's almost like the Joker or something coming to town, And so I love that. I love that aspect. And I know some people have asked me, like, they'll say, do you mean sorted or do you mean assorted? And I'll say, yes, I mean assorted because it has such a varied or an assorted, like it's so many different things. The both Baker and the hotel, like the hotel was a cancer clinic. Before that was a girls' school. It was a luxurious resort. It was abandoned,
Yeah.
And Baker was a populist radio show host. He was an inventor, a machinist. He was a vaudeville magician, and on and on, entrepreneur, you name it. So
I'm going to do one last question,
okay.
And then I think our time is up. But Are there any stories or details that you decided to leave out of the final version of your book? And if so, could you tell us about them?
Oh gosh, honestly, well, yeah, honestly, there was a woman that was very sort of mysterious. That was Baker was a ladies' man, and he was married briefly, but he always had all kinds of girlfriends throughout his life. And there was a woman named Thelma Yount, and she shows up quite a bit, but she's very mysterious. But she was mostly like his money, the woman that was handling the money, and she would, they would bundle it, and like as Baker was making large sums of cash at the Crescent, he was having that all transferred to Mexico, where his radio station was. Yeah, and Thelma would actually take the money down there, like she also handled his Baker Hospital down in Mexico, because he had a radio station on the Mexican border as well. He was known as a border blaster because that's after he got ran out of Muscatine for practicing without a license, and also not having a radio license, and So anyway, he goes down there and that's where many unlicensed radio hosts, or I guess you'd call them, that have these radio stations would blare their music up to the US with, amping up their wattage to where it's like you could be heard clear up in Canada and all the way out to like Honolulu. And so there's so many different stories with Baker that you could just go off on a complete tangent, like when he was in Mexico, like I said, being this border blaster, because he had his radio station and his cancer hospital, and then the two were sort of, that's where he would, blare out all his demagogic, his populist rhetoric and all that. Another aspect is that, I was able to actually get that into the book, was the fact that, when they found those jars in 2019 on the hospital grounds, I was actually just finishing my book when that happened. And, but it was so interesting because I had actually interviewed the guy that, as a young boy, which I showed you guys, he and his little friend, they snuck into the Crescent after Baker's arrest and incarceration. And so once again, that's when it was just empty, but I wasn't able to really, because I had to, the thing is with nonfiction, you can go down so many rabbit holes. There's so many different directions that you can go, and you just have to stop at some point. Cause I was like,
yes,
maybe I need to go more into these jars which I did. It's in my book, but or even like
that's
I said,
another book right there.
Well, right. Sure. Yeah. Well, actually what follows is true is the umbrella or the banner over other books that I will be doing about different strange things, different strange locations with strange pasts, historic, places. And so
great.
I do have other books, so that will be on the way. So, but they won't take 15 years to do like this one.
It's that first one that takes so long. And then after that, you can just crank them out, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. So,
well, thank you so much for joining us and for being here. This was a perfect start to October.
Yes.
All things are spooky.
Right.
So this was perfect. And we'll let people know when the book is available for them to purchase, and go to the Kickstarter page. Next month, everybody, we're going to be joined by Eric Yonk, I think is his last name.
Oh, wow. Great.
Yes. Yeah. So we're doing kind of a little series here. Who's going to discuss quacks and crusaders.
Eric's, he's excited about my book, by the way. Eric is. Yeah.
Great.
I interviewed Eric for my book.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. So he's going to talk. So if you really enjoyed this story about Norman Baker, you can hear more about Norman Baker and other quacks and crusaders.
Wow.
That's going to be Wednesday, November. Oh, my thing cut off. Wednesday, November 3rd at noon. So we hope to see everybody back here. We will be, as far as I know, we're going to be virtual again. So thank you again, Sean.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip to Eureka. He's going there right now. So, and everybody check out the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.